Hello, today I'm going to be quilting this little table runner of this turkey, and this was from the Better Homes and Garden Quilts and More from fall of 2019. The pattern is in that magazine and it's shown as a pillow, but I'm just going to use it as a table topper, and I am going to quilt it today. So the first thing that I do when I prepare for quilting is I find a piece of batting that is approximately 2 inches larger than the item that I'm quilting. Since I'm doing this on my domestic machine, I don't need as much backing or batting as if it was done on a long arm machine. So a long arm machine has areas on the bars where the fabric is connected, the backing fabric, so it has to be larger so it can roll around those bars to go into the long arm machine. So check with your long armor to see how much bigger your backing needs to be. But today we're going to be doing some straight line quilting on my home machine. So I have found 2 pieces of batting that are not quite big enough to make one piece. So I'm going to show you how I join the pieces to make it into one piece. So the first thing I do is I'm going to find a square edge on both pieces. And there isn't really a great one, so I'm going to go ahead and just using my ruler and my rotary cutter, I'm going to create a straight edge and just discard that little piece. And then on this other piece where I'm going to join it, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to create a straight edge. And discard this piece. And then I will be using an interfacing to join these 2 sections together. And what I'm going to do is cut a strip of interfacing and adhere it with my iron to both sides of my seam to make my 2 pieces of batting as one. Okay, so to do that, the interfacing that I am using is a Pellon. It is a fusible shear weight, and this happens to be number 906F. And it is, has the glue dots on one side. And I'm going to cut a strip that's approximately 1 inch to 1.25 inches. And one for the front and one for the back as well. Okay. And then what I'm going to do is take my iron and I'm going to match these 2 pieces up, my flat edges together, and then I'm going to take the fusible side facing the batting and just go ahead and press that so it is locked into place. Okay, I have my ironing surface and my iron is heating up, and I've placed the 2 edges that I just cut so they're nice and straight. I butted them up next to each other. I did pay attention to the batting. It has a side that has like the little, you can see like little balls of the fibers kind of bunched together. And I've made sure that that is facing up on both pieces. And then next what I'm going to do is right over the seam where I have pushed them together, I'm going to center my piece of fusible interfacing so that the fusible is down towards the batting, and I'm going to iron it in place. Okay, and there's a little bit left that didn't get covered, so I'm going to take another strip and just go ahead and overlap that just a little bit, and then press that into place as well. Okay, then I'm just going to snip that off at the top and then flip this over and do the same thing on the other side. So I'm putting the fusible side down, so the bumpy glue dots are going to go over the seam and press that into place. And there's just a little bit more at the top, so we'll add another little section. And we can just trim that off. And now we have a piece of batting that is large enough to go into my table runner. Okay, continuing the layering process, I have a piece of fabric and that I'm going to use as the backing, and I'm going to make sure that I have a generous amount on all four sides. I have approximately 3 inches here, and I'm just going to cut on my fabric to make sure that I have about the same amount all the way around. And again, if you were having a long arm or quilt your piece, you may need approximately 5 inches extra on each side, but check with your long armor to ensure that you have the right amount of backing. And then what I'm going to do is have my backing face down, so the wrong side is facing down. I'm going to put my piece of batting onto the backing material and just smooth it out. And then lastly, I will add the piece that is going to be the top of my table topper. I will go ahead and spray this together to base the layers, and I'm using a 505 temporary adhesive spray. It does the best job. I don't find that it gums up my needle, or I don't have any problems with it. I do spray it outside though, just to be in a well ventilated area. And so I'm going to go ahead and do that now. Okay, now my piece is all sandwiched together. It is glued, so it's not going to fall off or come apart. And I prefer the glue. That way I am not worried about wrinkles that could happen in my backing. I'm just kind of focused on what's going on the top of my project. And also then I don't have to stop and take out pins. It's just a way I prefer, but there are many different ways that you can baste. Okay, and I have decided that I am going to do straight lines approximately 1/2 inch apart all the way across this little table topper. So what I'm going to do to get started is I have a ruler and some painter's tape, and I'm going to mark off sections that are approximately 4 inches apart. And that is going to kind of subdivide my project. It's going to make it easier when I start quilting, that it will kind of hold. If I go every 4 inches and quilt a line, that's going to hold everything in place, and I'm not going to worry about it shifting as I go back and fill in all those increments inside of that. So I am going to start in the center and line up. I have a line here. I've got some piecing lines here that I'm looking at just to make sure that I have a straight line. And then I'm going to take a piece of tape and the length of my project. And then I'm just going to lay that up next to the edge of the ruler and just scooch it over, and then go ahead and press that in place. And that is going to be where I stitched my first line. So what I'm going to do here, I just have a regular pin, and I'm going to just make myself a little note that I'm stitching on this side of the line. That's where I've marked it, that I don't want to go on that side. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just put 2 more down since I have the ruler here. And I know that this is going to be a stitching line, and I'm picking 4 inches because that can be divided into 1/2 inch increments, and it'll also give me a few rows of stitching that will stabilize this in place. So I'm going to put my 4-inch line right along where I'm going to stitch that. So my tape is there and I've just lined it up, and then I'm going to put another piece of tape on this side. And just lay that right up against the ruler. And I'm going to go ahead and make myself a little arrow so I know which side I'm sewing on. And then let's mark one on the other side. And again, I'm lining up my 4-inch line on the edge of the tape where I'm going to put a set of stitches. And just line that tape right up along the edge there. And this time I'm stitching on the other side of the tape. So that's why I'm marking it, so that I know I have equal distance apart that I'm going to actually be quilting. So let's take it to the machine and do 3 rows to just hold it in place. Okay, I am back at the sewing machine, and what I have my walking foot on my machine. I also have a little adhesive mat that's kind of laying on top of my surface. It kind of fills in all the little gaps where you can see here, like there's little notches where the machine is set down into the table, and even like where the stitch plate is on the machine, it creates a little bump. And those little, even as tiny as they are, little inconsistencies can cause a place for your quilt to kind of get hung up on. So putting something over it like a Supreme slider or something to cover up all the little cracks and crevices, and it's also slippery, so your quilted item will flow smoothly over the surface. Okay, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring my top thread up, and I've just pressed down my needle and held onto the top thread, and that pulled up the bottom thread. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start approximately in 1/2 inch on the backing and batting. So I'm not yet to my quilt top, and that's just going to kind of lock the stitches and everything, get them started. If any nests or anything are going to happen, it's going to be on a part that I'm going to cut off later before I add the binding. So then I'm just going to go ahead and I'm just going to take my time, and I'm stitching right next to the edge of that tape. So the tape is giving me a guideline so that I can have a nice straight line, and it's also a temporary line. So when I take the tape off after I've sewn this line, I'm not going to have a pen mark or anything that I need to remove later on. It's just very temporary, and I can use that same piece of tape and I'll move it to another section, but it just gives me a very visual place to line up my needle so that I know my line is going to be straight on my quilted item. Okay, and then when I get to the end, I have stitched off onto the batting again, and I'm just going to raise my needle and go ahead and just pull this out. I'm going to cut my threads, and I'm just going to leave those there because I'm going to trim all that off to put the binding on later, so I'm not so concerned about that. And then I'm just going to go back to the top and go over to the next line of tape where I can sew my next stitching line. So again, I'm going to pull up my thread. Whoops, not where the tape is, but the tape is forgiving. If you do go ahead and stitch into it, it can just be ripped off. It's not that big of a deal. Okay, so I've got my threads out of the way, and I've started my needle just a little ways off of the top of my quilt, And I'm just going to stitch right next to that tape. And if I get a little bit off, it's okay, because I'm going to remove the piece of tape, and then no one will ever know later on that it wasn't exactly against the tape mark. But I'm just kind of taking my time. I have set my stitch length to be approximately 2.0, but it does vary from machine models. So just make it so that it's a pleasing stitch length. I like them a little bit wider on quilted things, as opposed to when I'm piecing, I do a much shorter stitch length. Okay, and so then if we remove the tape, you can see that I have one line of stitching complete, and it's fairly straight. It looks pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead and mark another row that's 4 inches over and stitch these out, and then we'll come back. Okay, I'm back at the mat, and I have stitching now every 4 inches apart. So now I'm a little bit more relaxed about my fabrics. I'm not worried about them shifting, because I've kind of done a row of stitching that's stabilizing. So it's holding all the layers in place. If I don't get to finish it for a few days, I'm not worried about the glue coming loose. It's kind of stabilized, it's held in place, so we don't have to be worried about that. So now I'm going to go, I did every 4 inches, so now I'm going to go ahead and cut that in half and mark a line that's 2 inches from each line. So I'm cutting the section in half, so at 2 inches I'm going to put a tape line and do another row of stitching. So what this I'm going to do that all the way across, and then if I decide it looks good, the stitching's 2 inches apart, I like the effect that it has, and I've run out of time, I don't want to quilt anymore, I can stop at that point. If I had said I'm going to stitch every ½ inch and gotten, you know, out to here, and then, oh, this is just not how I thought it was going to be, it doesn't look as nice as I wanted it to, but at that point I'm committed, so I'd have to continue all the way out. And then if I started here and didn't have any kind of stabilization stitches over here, as I worked my way to the outside, going only every ½ inch, I would notice my fabric start to shift, and it could get off kilter where it's not straight. So by go ahead and breaking it up into sections, it's easier to work with. So I'm going to use the same procedure where I am going to move my tape, and I just keep using the tape as many times until it stops sticking. And my section is here, that's 4 inches, and so I'm going to cut that in half, which would be 2 inches. So I'm placing my ruler on the stitch line, and it is now halfway between the other stitch line, and I'm going to mark that area with this piece of tape. And I've got my little arrows already on there, so I know which side I'm going to be stitching on. And then I'm just going to continue across and move this piece of tape. And then I'm just going to keep doing this the whole way through. So after I get all the 2 inch lines stitched, I can decide to be done, or then I can break those in half. Then I would go every 1 inch. And if I decided that was good enough, I could stop stitching. Or if I thought, no, I want to go ahead and do the ½ inch, I'll just keep going until I have all the rows stitched that I want to have quilted. Okay, when I get to a row where I kind of have run out of room for my quilt to just flow smoothly through the machine, I will go ahead and just roll it or fold it so that I can get free motion there where it's not getting caught up on anything. And we'll just go ahead and keep stitching until all of our lines are in place. And there again, I'm just stitching right next to the edge of that tape. Stopping and repositioning my hands as needed. Okay, I have the table topper quilted where it's 1 inch apart, and now I'm going to go ahead and divide that down to 1/2 inch. But I want to talk a little bit about working with a bigger quilt and maneuvering the extra fabric that you have. I have chosen to start at the top and work my way down through all the lines of stitching. It's small enough that I can roll it and feed it to get all the way to this edge and still have it feed smoothly through my machine here. What I could do, and especially on a bigger quilt where you have a lot more fabric to manage, when I get to the halfway point, I will stitch everything going this direction from the top down. And then what I can do is I can turn my piece and stitch everything from here over from the bottom to the top. So I kind of just do that rotation halfway through. On a bigger quilt, it just helps, keeping track of all the excess fabric over here. It's a little bit easier to work with. And I also wanted to show you, once that I have gotten down to these 1-inch increments, my presser foot, if you can see, fits quite nicely down the middle. So I am going to not tape these, but I'm just going to go guide my presser foot evenly down through those 2 rows, and then that way it'll go a little faster. I'm okay with it. If it gets a little bit not straight, it's fine. It is just going to speed up the process a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. And I'm just taking my time to make sure that I've got the presser foot going evenly spaced between those 2 lines. And I'll just continue until it's completed. Okay, here's the finished product. It is quilted a 1/2 inch apart. And I really like the way that it turned out. I like the looks of that scale on a smaller item. If I was doing a bigger quilt, I might not need to go 1/2 inch. I could maybe do 7/8, but just kind of keep that in mind, the scale of your project to the width that your lines are spaced apart. So I hope this gives you some confidence and some skills that you could try to quilt your own quilts on your domestic machine. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.